how did you choose the farmers that you depicted, that you documented?
It was mostly word of mouth. Let me preface it by saying that the whole concept for this project started when a friend of mine, the co-producer on the project, Noah Sabich, who is a Springfield area native and who lives in Milwaukee now, we were on a long bike ride, and this was now probably 4 years ago. And he had been listening to some oral histories that had been recorded for what was then Sangamon State University, and he was just fascinated by them. He's a real history buff. And he was telling me the story and how he was kind of interested at the time in doing some of these oral histories himself. And at that point in my career, I'd been away from the paper for a little bit, and I was trying to think about getting into doing some video work, and I thought maybe this would be a chance for me to have a practice project, I guess is what I was thinking. You know, I could go along and I could film the interview, but I had some ideas of how it might look in the end. And so that's where it started. Noah, at that point, he doesn't have a background in video production. He had a full-time career and a growing family, and so he didn't become as involved as I got. I got kind of carried away, and so I started asking around. As it turns out, I have a friend who is a farm manager based in Sherman, and I checked in with him. Once I got to know a couple people, names he had given me, then I might ask them if they knew of other people, and I just sort of reached out to some of the contacts I'd had from my days at the newspaper. In the agricultural community, and I went out and I met them, and I was looking for folks who had good memories, could tell a good story, and I ended up with a group of people that you might think I'd end up with nothing but people who raised corn and soybeans, but I was pleased that we found someone who raised dairy cattle, and Vicki Hulsketter and her husband who raised hogs, and so there was a little bit of variety, about as much as you can get in the scheme of things, but it was really by word of mouth basically, and I would hear about people, I would hear about what their story was, and I might be interested enough to reach out to them, and so I think it worked out very well. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Yeah, that was just very, very good. I grew up just about a stone's throw from Lauer, so I was glad to see Lauer's name out there.
Thank you.
Not so much of my dad.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this before. I'll tell a story very quickly. My own grandfather farmed in Marshall County. The farm was about 30 minutes or so north of Peoria. Peoria is where I grew up. And so I spent a lot of time there when I was a kid. Almost every Sunday we were there for our Sunday dinners, and of course on the holidays, Christmases and Easters. And my grandfather retired from farming when I was only 6 years old. That would have been 1966, and he died about 6 or 7 years after that. So I never talked to him about farming because I was a child, I wasn't that interested, and so I never got to hear him talk about how hard farming was in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. I heard those stories from my mom when I grew up later. My grandfather farmed through the worst of the Depression. My mom would tell us stories about how corn was piled. She remembered corn being piled on the drive because they couldn't sell it. And my own grandfather wrote in his journal about the devastation that year, that summer in 1936, when chinch bugs ruined everything. And chinch bugs in the drought. And so when I got to listen to the stories that Joe Donovan and Harvey Bettis would talk about, it was, for me, I understood then how hard it was for my grandfather, even though I didn't know that personally from him at the time. I do know now how difficult it was for all those people that farmed through that period of time. And the other thing that I learned, especially from Harvey, was how inventive they were and how imaginative they were at fixing things and building things themselves and fabricating things that they needed. I was just fascinated by that. Harvey in particular, and Harvey was just a gold mine. He met all the criteria about being a good storyteller and having a crystal clear memory of all those things. I mean, when I listen to him, talk about how hard that summer was, his dad trying to keep his herd of dairy cattle alive. I thought, man, it was almost like being there and just listening to firsthand account of what it was like. And God love him, Harvey died last month. He was 104 years old. And we lost Joe in August of 24, just before the film was finished, so he didn't get to see it, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
I have two sort of more technical questions, I guess. The oldest film clips that you had, I'm interested in where those came from. And I'm also interested in how you got the camera back in exactly the same spot for those seasonal shots. Because I was looking at the grove of trees, and boy, they did not jerk from spring to summer and summer to fall. I was wondering if you actually planted something in the ground to put the tripod back in when the next season rolled around.
I pitched a tent and I camped there all year long. Did everyone hear those questions?
Why don't you repeat them?
The first one was the technical information about the old clips,
The oldest
archival
clips,
clips.
Where were those from, the movies?
And the second question was about the lockdown shot of the seasons through the transition through the seasons. So the answer to the first question was that the Library of Congress is a vast resource of material from all periods of American history. They have a lot of royalty-free imagery, film that you can access without cost and without paying, rights usages and all those sorts of things. I did have a small budget. There are a couple films I had to pay a modest licensing fee for. I can't remember some of the footage of the tractor pulling a plow through the soil, that sort of thing. I think a couple of those I had to pay for. But it's easily accessible. There's lots of places where you can go and look and find those things. I had hoped when I started that there might be some of these folks who had their own home movies, maybe 16mm films or whatever, and none of them did, unfortunately. They had a lot of their own pictures, of course. The answer to your second question about the seasonal shot was, I'm a big bicyclist. I ride my bike all over Sangamon County and other counties, and that particular location I discovered, well, I don't know when. I've been down that road many times. It's between Williamsville and Mount Pulaski. And I think during production, when I was doing the production work, I remembered that spot, and a snowstorm had come up, and I wanted to get out and drive and see if I could get some footage of snow, because I hadn't had any of that to represent the winter season. And I found that spot, and the first shot I made was during that little brief snowstorm, and it didn't last very long. It was damn cold, but the snow didn't last too long, but I got enough. And so I just made a mental note of where I was. I took a picture of the sign, and I went back in the spring, and I think it was either when I was there in the spring or for the summer shot, when a pickup truck pulled up, and a man asked me what I was doing, and of course, I'm always sensitive about people who might be concerned about who's this guy on their property. I really wasn't on the property. I was still actually on the side of the road, but he turned out to be very nice, and I struck up a conversation with him, explained to him what I was doing, and I asked him if I could come back when he was harvesting, because I wanted that clip also. And as it turned out, I was able to check back with them, and he let me know when they were going to be in that field, and I got back. The one thing I didn't get was a summer thunderstorm at that very spot, which is what I would have liked to have had. But and I'm glad it was soybeans, because if it had been corn, it would have been just a big green wall and kind of nondescript. I was just thinking the other day about how much I miss the sound of crickets and flies buzzing around. A nice sunny, hot day would be nice about right now, at least for a little bit. But then I complain about that too when it gets here. Is there anybody here that has? I mean, there's got to be somebody here. Maybe a lot of you have not too far back into your own family tree a connection to farming. Maybe your grandparent or great grandparent. Yeah. See, that's very, very common. Very common trait. Yeah.
That's a good question and observation, Rich, because I think that some of the lease forms that we have out there, they've created a disconnect with the land. And I mean, I was out in Montana, where he had that one, where he went to Montana. When I was at a festival out there in June, and I thought it was really interesting. When you walked in, it was like, say you and Dana were going to go to a concert, you have to get a band.
Mhm.
That's what you did at, this particular festival. But they had like in big white letters, "Land is kin." And you go, whoa, that's a little bit of a different spin on it than stewardship that we had. So anyway, that's just an observation.
Yeah, and another point I would like to make, and maybe you all know this already. There's a lot of people. There's a perception that a lot of the farmland now is corporate owned. And if you looked at a document and looked at ownership, there'd be a lot of LLCs, corporations. But behind most of those corporations are families. They form an LLC for legal and liability purposes. So it's not true that farmland is all now owned by corporations. There's a lot of very big corporations that own a lot of farmland. But I think if you were to drive between here and Peoria, for example, most of the land you would see would probably be family owned if you were to look that far into it. Don't you think that's right?
Yeah, I would say that's a good statement, Rich. Actually, the number one landowner in the state of Illinois is a Mormon church.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's, and I'm not trying to make a statement about that, but one of the things, I think that you got to think about is, for estate planning and stuff, is the farmers use the LLCs as a form, to actually, and instead of, you get 40 acres or 80 or whatever, they use percentages or whatever. So, that's to facilitate transition between generations. So, the other one I think that's interesting is that piece that Tom Martin's doing in Mount Pulaski. The typical deal, I think Farmers Union is one that you might want to go to their website, but to actually figure out what the farmer gets as a percentage of the dollar, it's like 14 cents. So, that's a major deal where, what's going on in the dollars that turn in Mount Pulaski and all that. That's, the food is medicine movement is catching on. Nutrient density is becoming, some awareness. I was talking to a med student at Harvest Market today. She's third year student, and it's really interesting to share about that.
Yeah, I really admire Tom. I've gotten to know Tom pretty well, and we've become friends, and I'm fascinated by what he's doing. I don't know, he talked about Market on the Hill. I don't know if he explained what Farm Fed was, but Farm Fed is the organization that he's very involved with. That's connecting these local growers, the kinds of folks you'd buy stuff from at our own local farmers market, but they might be working on just a slightly larger scale. And he's trying to connect those growers with the institutional customers. He didn't mention that, but the whole idea that we live in what's called the breadbasket of the world, and so much of the produce that we consume here comes from the other side of the country. It's kind of ironic. Yeah, and so what Farm Fed, what Tom would like to see is, our schools, the hospitals, universities, and so on and so forth, like he mentioned, the institutional customers, he'd like to see them being supplied with produce that's grown, within 30, 40, 50 miles of Springfield. And it doesn't seem like it would be that hard, but, change is very difficult. Okay.
The Lincoln Museum and State Museum did that extensive oral history of Illinois agriculture program. I'm curious if the interviews you've done here will be or could be or are integrated into that oral history program?
That's a great question, because it brings up something I needed to mention. In the film you see that I worked in conjunction with the University of Illinois Springfield and Sangamon Experience. And that's important because Ann Mosley, who I worked with, Ann is the director of the Sangamon Experience at UIS. What you just saw, this 43-minute film, is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's just it's compilation of interviews, the interviews I did, and I actually created a profile of each of those 10 individuals. So there's a separate film that range anywhere from 30 minutes to 60 minutes on every one of those 10 people. And those 10 films, plus this one, are all on the Sangamon Experience website. You can find them there. It's a, it's a little bit difficult to navigate that website, but if you Google Sangamon Experience, all one word, Sangamon Experience, you'll find the Soil and Soul, and then if you start digging into that, you'll see the film on each of those 10 people. And if you're really, really into history and farming, I think they're fascinating. I love working with all these people. Video, film is not the background I come from. In all my years at the paper, I did probably 4 or 5 videos, and I probably did a couple of those with my iPhone. So there was a steep learning curve putting this all together, and I did it by myself. It's just that in the end, I loved every minute I spent with these people. In all my years at the paper, I loved spending time. I loved the assignments that would take me to a farm. I liked doing that, like being out there, I guess because I have those memories of my own. It was a lot of work to pull all those things together and get them done on time. Even though I spent so many years meeting deadlines, it was still it was one of the biggest deadlines I had.
So where else do you plan to show the video, and how will it be accessible for people from all walks of life across America?
Well, it will be available through that website, Sangamon Experience website, in perpetuity, and we have shown it. It's been selected for 3 different film festivals, 2 in Iowa, and most recently the Route 66 International Film Festival. I was here in Springfield. It showed there in October. And I've shown it a couple other places between now and then, but I don't have any other pending invitations, so for now it's available on the website. It's easier to find on my own website if you want to look there. But the 10 profiles are all on the Sangamon Experience site. I'll be here for a little bit if questions you want to come up. Otherwise, thank you all so very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here.
Thank you.